Every day, my deliveries follow the same rhythm, the same streets, the same quiet anticipation. I knew the building by heart, the chipped tiles at the entrance, the faint hum of the elevators, the way the glass doors caught the morning light just right. It was a routine I could do blindfolded, a series of motions that felt both familiar and oddly comforting. But nothing in my routine prepared me for the way he always appeared. Breckenhale lived in the penthouse on the 20th floor. I didn't know much about him, nor did I want to, not really. There was a magnetism about him I couldn't place, a kind of quiet authority that didn't demand attention, but claimed it anyway. Every day, he answered the door in a towel, and every day, I resisted the urge to linger just a fraction too long. Our exchanges were minimal, just enough to pass a package, but the silence between us spoke in ways words never could. At first, I told myself it was curiosity, nothing more. Who would notice a man like him, with his carefully composed posture, and the way his gaze seemed to track every movement, even when it appeared absent? But there was more, attention, subtle and insistent, that made my pulse quicken even when I was only glancing at the top of his head as he accepted the delivery. I started timing my route, subtly adjusting when I arrived, hoping to catch him at just the right moment. I would never admit it aloud, but the anticipation became the most vivid part of my day. I remember the first day I noticed the way he lingered. It was barely noticeable, a slight tilt of his head, a pause in the way he reached for the package. But something shifted, tiny as it was. I caught myself holding my breath, wondering if he knew I was watching, or if I imagined entirely. My co-worker Judson teased me once about it, his voice laced with that sharp edge he always carried. "You're daydreaming about the guy in the towel again, aren't you?" He smirked, expecting a laugh, but I shrugged it off, muttering something noncommittal. Yet, even as I laughed, a small part of me wondered if Judson knew something I didn't. Weeks passed, and the pattern became a quiet obsession. I memorized the way of the packages, the subtle click of the elevator as it reached his floor, the faint scent of whatever cologne or soap he wore that I could never quite identify. It wasn't physical desire alone. It was a strange, consuming curiosity, the kind that makes ordinary routines feel charged, electric. The way he moved, the way he spoke only a few words, the way he let his eyes linger, even unconsciously, all of it unsettled me in the most compelling way. There were moments when I thought about speaking, about breaking the fragile line of civility with a question or a remark, but I never did. Each silence between us stretched longer, heavier, full of a tension neither of us named. I began imagining his life behind the glass doors, picturing a room that mirrored the discipline in his voice and the subtle loneliness in his movements. I wonder if he ever felt the same pull I did, or if it was entirely my imagination coloring the gaps in our conversations. One afternoon, a heavy package shook slightly in my hands, and he stepped closer than usual, brushing my arm accidentally, or perhaps not. The brush lasted a fraction of a second, yet it left a mark on my awareness that I carried with me the rest of the day. I couldn't shake the sensation, a warmth that spread unbidden, filling the corners of my mind. Later, I caught myself staring at the elevator doors as if they held the answers to questions I had yet to ask, imagining him waiting on the other side, the towel clinging loosely, the faint curve of the smile I had never actually seen. Even Judson noticed a change. He made a casual remark about the guy upstairs and the way I seemed distracted during our rounds. But I dismissed it, laughing along, though the laughter didn't reach my eyes. I began to question my own feelings, wondering whether it was simple intrigue or something more complicated, something I had no right to name. There was a thrill in the uncertainty, an addictive pull towards someone who was never mine to know. It was in those fleeting seconds, standing in the doorway, exchanging nothing more than a glance, that the conflict began to root itself. I wanted to know him, to cross the invisible boundary that separated our worlds, yet I feared the consequences of rejection, of misreading him, of revealing too much of myself. And still, I returned day after day, each delivery a silent ritual, each glance a small rebellion against my own restraint. The pattern held, unbroken, until one day I noticed something different. Brecken didn't immediately retreat behind the door. He lingered, watching me place the package with an intensity that made my chest tighten. For a moment, the towel felt like more than just clothing or lack of it. It was a symbol of vulnerability, an unspoken invitation I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. I stepped back, unsure whether to speak, to leave, or to risk the tiny step closer that neither of us had yet dared. And that was when I realized the truth of it. We had never exchanged more than a sentence, yet somehow he was already in my head. Every day, the anticipation grew heavier, more urgent. Every day, the glance of the elevator, the faint click of the package, the pause in his step. It all threaded together into a story I hadn't yet dared to read aloud. There was no turning back now. Something was coming, something I couldn't name, but I knew it would change everything. I walked away that day with the familiar weight of the last package in my hands, the hallway light stretching out before me, and a single thought repeating. I had never delivered more than packages here, but I was starting to deliver pieces of myself too, whether I liked it or not. I had grown accustomed to the rhythm of our silent interactions, the unspoken exchange that pulsed between the packages I carried and the way Breckenhale lingered behind the door. But some routines, no matter how comforting, were fragile. That morning, as I stepped into the familiar lobby and adjusted the strap of my delivery bag, I felt the faintest tremor in the usual predictability of the day. The elevator hummed upward, each floor passing beneath my fingertips like the ticking of an unseen clock. I rehearsed my greeting, as I always did, yet it seemed unnecessary this time. The door to his penthouse swung open almost immediately, and I froze, a jolt of apprehension rippling through me. Brecken was on the floor, the towel clinging precariously, his hand pressed to his forehead, as though trying to anchor himself against the world. Panic surged. My instincts, honed from years of fast-paced deliveries and sudden emergencies, took over before my mind caught up. "Are you okay?" I asked, voice low but urgent. He didn't answer at first, only groaned softly, a sound that made my stomach tighten. Carefully, I helped him to his feet, noting the subtle sheen of sweat on his brow, the pale flush of exhaustion. He was lighter than I expected, and I realized just how vulnerable he was in that moment, stripped of both the protective barrier of his composed demeanor and the literal barrier of clothing. He spoke finally, his voice strained but composed, as though testing the air to see if it would swallow his words. I just fainted. I'm fine." There was an attempt at casualness, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him it was nothing, that help was always closer than it seemed, but the words died in my throat. I felt exposed in my own way, the sudden intimacy of the situation unraveling the careful distance I had maintained. Brecken's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I noticed the fatigue behind the allure, the weight he carried silently. He was not just a figure behind a towel, a puzzle of quiet desire. I saw him as he was, a man under strain, balancing on the edge of collapse and composure. I realized that the glances, the pauses, the half-smiles had all been fragments of someone cautiously guarding himself, someone willing to let me glimpse but never enter. "I should sit," he murmured, gesturing toward a low leather chair. I stepped back, suddenly aware of the space between us, of the lines we had skirted for so long. We moved together yet apart, each step measured, each breath careful. He sank into the chair, and I found myself standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, the silence stretching and twisting around us. It was a different tension than the one I had grown used to, the tension of something real, tangible, and dangerously intimate. Finally he spoke, and his words held a weight that I hadn't expected. "Thank you for stopping. Not everyone would." There was no flirtation, no teasing, only the quiet acknowledgement of gratitude. I felt a flutter of something I couldn't name, pride, maybe, or relief, or the start of something deeper. I nodded, brushing a strand of imagined responsibility from my shoulder, unsure how to articulate the jumble of emotions swirling inside me. I worry about these things sometimes," he continued, a hesitant confession slipping past his usual restraint. "I get caught up in work, deadlines, appointments, and I forget myself." His honesty was disarming, and I found myself listening with a care I hadn't realized I was capable of. The penthouse, usually a backdrop to my brief deliveries, transformed into a space charged with human vulnerability, a place where the walls themselves seemed to soften in recognition of our shared awareness. Before I left, Brecken said something that would linger in my mind long after I returned to the elevator. "If you ever have a few minutes after your shift, I owe you a drink." It was casual, almost offhand, yet it carried a subtle invitation, a crack in the otherwise impenetrable barrier between us. I wanted to refuse, to maintain the careful distance I had enforced so diligently, but a part of me wanted to accept, to see beyond the facade, to risk the uncertain pull of curiosity and desire. I didn't answer immediately, only offered a small nod before retreating to the elevator. The moment replayed in my head repeatedly as I walked through the city streets, the weight of the package in my bag suddenly less important than the weight of what had shifted between us. The memory of his tired eyes, the vulnerability in his stance, the almost imperceptible way he had looked at me lingered like a whisper I couldn't ignore. Later that evening, I found myself lingering near the penthouse building, lingering at a distance that allowed me to watch without being seen. The streetlights stretched long shadows, and the city carried its usual hum, but everything felt slower, more deliberate, as though the world had shifted just for us. I thought of the invitation, simple and yet impossibly complex, and I realized I wanted to accept, not because I craved a drink, but because I wanted to step into his world, however cautiously. Judson's voice echoed in my mind, teasing yet pointed, "Careful, man. Guys like that, they don't see you the way you think." I dismissed it outwardly, but the warning lingered in the corners of my consciousness. Perhaps Judson was right, but I couldn't ignore the pull, the way the quiet connection between us had grown heavy with unspoken meaning. Something was changing, subtle but inexorable, and I sensed that the routine I had counted on was shifting into something neither of us could predict. The night ended with me staring out at the city from the edge of the street, imagining the penthouse balcony above, imagining Brecken there, wondering about me as much as I was thinking of him. The wine invitation was more than an offer. It was a hinge, a pivot point that had the power to alter the trajectory of our relationship, if only I had the courage to step through. And in that quiet, electric pause, I understood that what had begun as a series of deliveries had transformed into something far more complex. Every glance, every pause, every small gesture had laid the groundwork for a connection I was only beginning to comprehend. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing with clarity. The routine had ended, and in its place was a fragile, thrilling start of something dangerous, something irresistible. The days after that night of wine and quiet conversation shifted the rhythm of my deliveries in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every elevator ride, every turn of the lobby tiles carried the memory of his tired eyes and the vulnerability he had revealed. The air between us had changed, charged with the weight of something unspoken, something delicate and impossible to name. I found myself replaying his words in my head, letting them linger longer than I should, wondering if he felt the same tension I did, or if I was reading too much into the silence that had stretched between us for weeks. Our encounters became subtly different. Brecken no longer answered the door with the same routine detachment. His glances lingered longer, and sometimes when he accepted a package, there was a faint hesitance, a weight in the way he held the box as if he wanted to prolong the exchange. I caught myself pausing at the threshold, my hands brushing against his just a little longer than necessary, feeling the almost imperceptible heat that traveled from him to me. Each day, I became more aware of him, more aware of myself. It was during one of these deliveries that I first heard the faint trace of a voice, not directed at me, a murmur that made my heart sink with curiosity and anxiety. Brecken was on the phone, and I caught a fragment. "He can't know. Not yet. Not until it's safe." I froze, my grip tightening on the package, as a chill of unease ran down my spine. My mind raced through possibilities, and for a moment, panic eclipsed desire. Was he speaking about me? About something I had unknowingly entangled myself in? The thought was sharp, like glass sliding over skin, and I retreated, suddenly self-conscious in the familiar doorway that had once felt safe. I spent the next deliveries in a haze of overthinking. Each glance felt loaded, every gesture now suspicious. I questioned everything I had interpreted as tension, as attraction. I wondered if I had misread him, if the moments of near touch had been accidental, meaningless. The pull between us remained, undeniable and confusing, but it was now entwined with doubt, with the fear that perhaps I had crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. Judson noticed the change immediately. He leaned against the counter during our breaks, a sly smile playing at the edges of his mouth. "Careful, man. You're getting too involved." I heard some things about him. Couldn't hurt to be cautious. His words were deliberately vague, but the implication was sharp. Brecken was being painted as someone dangerous, someone whose charm concealed intentions that could wound. I wanted to dismiss it, to believe that Judson was merely trying to protect me, but a flicker of doubt settled in my chest. I began to wonder whether the invisible thread connecting us could withstand the outside interference, or if it was already fraying. That evening, I found myself hovering near the penthouse, not out of duty but out of compulsion. The city hummed below me, indifferent to the turbulence in my chest. I replayed the encounter, the way it looked at me as if weighing my every thought, every reaction. There was an intimacy there, yes, but also a caution, a barrier I could not yet cross. I remembered his words about deadlines and exhaustion, about forgetting himself, and I realized how little I truly knew him despite the daily proximity. He was a puzzle, pieces revealed only sparingly, and I could feel the edges pressing against me, teasing, daring, but never yielding. I decided to risk a small gesture. The next delivery, I lingered just a moment longer than usual, offering a smile, a comment about the weather, something to bridge the chasm of silence. He returned the smile hesitant, almost apologetic in its restraint. And yet it was enough. Enough to remind me that beneath the uncertainty, beneath the whispered warnings and overheard fragments, there was a connection that had weight, that mattered. But the calm was deceptive. A week later, I overheard Judson's words, carefully framed as casual advice, but piercingly calculated. "You know, he talks about you. Not always the way you'd want. Better to watch yourself before you get in too deep." My stomach twisted. I wanted to confront him, to demand the truth, but a part of me feared it. The possibility that my trust had already been manipulated, that the careful bond one felt with Brecken was vulnerable to deceit. I tried to focus on the deliveries, on the packages, on anything that could anchor me in the mundane. But every glance at the penthouse door reminded me of the conversation we had shared, the almost touch that had lingered in my mind. I began to question myself, wondering if desire had blinded me, if my imagination had built bridges where none existed. The weight of uncertainty pressed against me relentlessly, and yet it was intoxicating, impossible to resist. When I finally saw Brecken again, there was a tension in the air neither of us addressed. We moved around each other like dancers in a delicate choreography, our hands almost brushing as we exchanged a package, our eyes locking just long enough to convey 1,000 unspoken thoughts. The energy between us was electric, yet fragile, a web spun of vulnerability, curiosity, and a hint of fear. I realized then that the conflict was no longer external alone. It was within me. The tension of desire and mistrust, the pull of curiosity and the sting of doubt, had woven themselves into a knot I couldn't untangle. I wanted to know him, to break through the silence that both protected and imprisoned us. But I was painfully aware that every step forward risked not just my heart, but the fragile trust that had begun to form. As I left that evening, walking through the quiet streets, I felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on me. The story we were building was no longer confined to fleeting glances and minimal conversation. It had taken on a shape, complex and unpredictable, teetering on the edge of revelation and betrayal. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I felt certain that nothing would ever be the same again. And as the city lights blurred past, I understood that the silence between us was no longer empty. It was pregnant with secrets, desire, and the unspoken questions that would define the next chapter of our lives. I had glimpsed vulnerability, felt the magnetic pull of connection, and already I feared the inevitable complications that awaited. Whatever came next, it would test the boundaries we had unconsciously set, and it would demand a reckoning with truths we were only beginning to confront. The tension I had carried for days became unbearable the moment I saw Brecken at the penthouse door again. His gaze, usually measured and distant, held something heavier, something I couldn't immediately name. I took a deep breath, gripping the package in my hands as if it could anchor me, and stepped inside, determined to confront the uncertainty that shadowed every delivery for the past week. "Brecken, I need to know." I began, Voice steadied and I felt. About the call I overheard. Is this about me? I expected anger or at least irritation, but instead, his eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hurt passing across his expression before he collected himself. He motioned for me to sit, and I obeyed, feeling the fragile tension between us stretched taut, like a wire ready to snap. I know, he said finally, voice low, careful. It wasn't about you at all. I was speaking about a business matter. A betrayal I didn't want to reveal until it was resolved. You were never involved. The relief that surged through me was immediate, yet tempered by guilt. I had allowed my imagination to construct a scenario that never existed, misjudging his intentions entirely. I felt foolish, and part of me wanted to apologize, to erase the days of doubt I had carried silently. But the relief was short-lived. Brecken's next words caught me off guard. There's something else, he said, hesitating. Judson came by a week ago, after one of your deliveries. He tried to make me believe you weren't trustworthy, that you might be talking about me behind my back. The sharp edge of betrayal cut through me like ice. Judson, who had always seemed a casual observer, had been manipulating the situation all along, playing on my uncertainties and planting seeds of distrust. I felt the weight of anger, guilt, and disbelief all at once. How had I allowed someone else to shape my perception of Brecken? How had I almost let their lies affect the fragile bond we were building? And yet, beneath the swirl of emotions, there was a profound awareness of the vulnerability that both of us had displayed. My own misjudgments and his cautious disclosures now intertwined, forming a delicate web that could either collapse or hold us together. Brecken didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it hang, heavy with unspoken thoughts and restrained emotions. I realized then that he had been patient with me, that his trust, though limited, had been deliberate and measured. The subtle restraint he had maintained throughout our encounters was not indifference. It was a careful guarding of something precious, something he only allowed glimpses of. I had nearly misread it, nearly let suspicion unravel connection I had grown to cherish. I should have trusted you, I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I let someone else plant doubt in my head, and I almost let it destroy whatever this is between us. My hands fidgeted with the edge of the package, but Brecken reached out, placing his hand close to mine, not touching fully, but bridging the gap that felt insurmountable. The gesture was enough, small, restrained, yet loaded with meaning. It was a promise, and an invitation, all at once. He nodded, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. You didn't ruin anything, he said softly. We're still here. I'm still here. And this, he gestured between us, is still real, at least to me. The simplicity of the words belied their weight. In that moment, I understood the gravity of the trust we had both extended, however subtly, and the care required to preserve it. We sat together in silence for a while, the unspoken emotions swirling in the quiet. It was a silence that no longer carried suspicion or tension, but one of acknowledgement, recognition of the fragility and the intensity of what had begun between us. I realized that desire, curiosity, and even the small betrayals of misunderstanding were part of a larger narrative, one that demanded patience, honesty, and courage. Eventually, I stood, feeling the pull of routine and reality drawing me back. Yet, something had shifted irrevocably. The packages I delivered were no longer the central focus. The connection, the tension, the unspoken moments had become the true weight I carried. And as I walked toward the elevator, I noticed a subtle change in the penthouse door. It opened fully now, without hesitation, without the half-closed barrier that had defined our encounters. It was a gesture, quiet but powerful, signaling trust, openness, and a willingness to allow me closer. I paused at the threshold, breathing in the space, the quiet hum of the penthouse, the subtle scent that had always accompanied him, and felt a profound sense of both relief and anticipation. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic confession, only the unspoken understanding that we had crossed a line together, one that neither of us could step back from. The story between us was still unfolding, delicate and unpredictable, but it was ours to explore, to navigate, and perhaps to protect. As I stepped into the elevator, the city stretched before me in muted lights and endless possibilities. I thought of the packages, the daily routine, the small gestures, and realized that they had been conduits for something far deeper. Every glance, every hesitant conversation, every moment of vulnerability had carried us forward, shaping a connection that had weathered doubt, secrecy, and interference. And yet, the story was far from finished. I understood, with a clarity that was almost frightening, that desire and trust were fragile companions, and that the threads we had woven could unravel with the slightest misstep. But for the first time, I was willing to risk it. I was willing to be present, to pay attention, to navigate the quiet intensity that had become the heartbeat of our encounters. Every day, I delivered a package, and every day, he delivered a version of himself no one else ever saw. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it was the beginning of something neither of us knew how to name, but that did not make it any less real. As the elevator doors closed, I carried both the weight of understanding and the lightness of anticipation. The future was uncertain, full of potential missteps and quiet revelations, but for the first time in weeks, I felt grounded, aware of the connection we had forged, and ready to see where it could lead. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was alive, full of possibility, and charged with the promise of everything yet to come.